Onassis Foundation. Dublab.
Welcome to the Quarantine Tapes, a daily podcast from Onassis, LA and Dublab. Hosted by Paul Holdengräber, this series chronicles shifting paradigms in the era of social distancing.
Hello?
Hello, could I please speak with Joy Harjo?
This is me.
Hello, Joy. This is Paul Holdengräber calling you from the Quarantine Tapes. Thank you so much for taking the time for this call.
That's cool. I'm here.
I'm so glad you're here. You know, you said something once that strikes me as so powerful. You said that when we're born, we remember everything.
Yes, I did say that.
And it's such a striking comment. It reminded me of a wonderful line in the second elegy of Rilke, where Rilke says, "Who has turned us around in this way that we no longer can see the open?" And I'm wondering what this sentence meant for you when you said it and how you think about it today.
Well, it's an interesting question given that I'm coming up to a big birthday and thinking about still. I think what happens when you certainly when you cross the 50 line, you start thinking about the door opening to the other side. Sort of like what how Rilke, I love the way Rilke stated that.
Yeah.
It is very much.
Yeah.
It is so, yeah, that's a poet. And, but it comes from being at the doorway of birth with grandchildren's birth and being part of that process. And when children come into the world, they see and know everything for a moment. Some longer than others. Some take a while. Some stay in that place longer than others. And some people never let it go. They're always have that door open. And often it's poets who keep that door open. And then when you hit a certain age, it's if you continue to feed and grow wisdom and grow possibility and grow impossibility, that door stays open. And then when you pass the 50 line and you start out the other way, that you head towards that door and the ability to comprehend the incomprehensible becomes, maybe there's a sliver opening where there was none before.
You know, you're the second poet laureate I speak to. The first one, when I was at the New York Public Library, was W.S. Merwin. And he said something to me once that is very striking. He said, "What we remember saves you."
What we remember. Well, I love Merwin and his poetry, and I got to see his place
Oh, you did?
And the plants in Maui is beautiful, and got to be in his house and his library, and
Wow.
the sense of him, which is absolutely there in his poetry.
Yes.
But I like thinking of Merwin being in memory. Memory is a living thing. It's not just a concept for addressing events that happened in the past that live somewhere in a brain. Rather, I think of memory as, I guess I could say, a holographic field, but it's even more than holographic. It's like holographic towards a third or fourth or fifth or seventh level. And it's a living being, and it moves forwards, backwards, and in the present. So that we're living, we might be living like right now as we speak, and we're interacting as living in a time, but within that exists all time. And I think being a poet or a musician, an artist, it teaches you that. I mean, a poem is really a construct of time, of memory, of place.
It's a way
and maybe that's how Merwin meant it,
I'm not sure, but there's something about leaving, as you were saying, leaving the door ajar.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think so, because it's compelling. It's compelling and it's mystery.
When I read that, when we're born, we remember everything, and I was reminded of that second. I think it's the second elegy where Rilke says, wer hat das so umgedreht? Who turned us, twisted us around in that way? And then you have this wonderful story, Joy, which I just loved, about bees, and that you were made to feel fearful of bees as a young girl.
Mm-hmm.
And I was thinking there's a connection between being born, remembering everything, and then being instilled with fear for bees.
I like that. You said, after you mentioned the bees, you said being born. And I thought bees, of course. Being born, remembering everything, and then then how fear.
Unintentional, but unintentional, but in a way it's wonderful, because what it demonstrates so clearly is the importance of listening for you.
It's all about listening. I think whether you're a mathematician, a scientist, a social worker, a bull rider, a weather person, whatever, it's all about listening. And of course, poetry is along with music and singers and musicians, is the penultimate, listeners. You're listening to history, you're listening to memory. I think, it's that's what poetry, and anyway, that's what it teaches me, because I think I'm the worst listener I have been. I came in kind of headstrong, and I'm just going to keep moving. I'm a very much a movement person. I'm very kinetic, and there's half of me is extremely mental. I'm very mentally, I what's the word? I think too much. And the other half is the poet, musician, mystic, in that, who prefers to go be beyond that open door and being in that kind of awareness.
Can you make our listeners understand your relationship with robins?
Oh, I have a story about Robin, and I have a new memoir coming out in September called Poet Warrior, A Call for Love and Justice. And I wrote a whole piece about the robin. And the story, my connection with robins, how it started when I killed a robin. Not really on purpose, but partly out of an angst and out of being a child. And the sun was going down. Things were going really awry in my home. And the robin and we had a communication. And it's almost like the robin gave itself up to teach me a lesson. And in that lesson, I learned, it's almost like the robin took me in. And so I've had a great respect for robins. And once I had moved back to Oklahoma, and I bought the house my sister had lived in for years, and I always noted the robins there and different robin families. It was the generations of robin family. So when I moved there, and I went out into the yard, and there was the elder robin, and he asked me, who are you? And so I told him, I said, I'm the sister of the family, of the woman who lived here for years. And so that satisfied him, and he went off. So he just needed to know. And so he went and told everybody. And then I would go out every morning around sunrise and play one of my flutes. And they didn't understand that. They had never heard a human being play a flute. And so they were talking among themselves, like, is this a bird human? And, this must be a bird human. And so, I don't know, I kept that connection with them. And when I moved from that house, I really missed that robin would be out every day telling all the news. I noticed that with robins. There's in the group families of robins, wherever I am, that there's one that's assigned, and they're kind of, in our tribe, we have a position kind of called the speaker, who talks about what's going on and what needs to be done and all of that. And so this robin, I missed that speaker robin. So when I moved, I got married and moved into my husband's house, which was in Tulsa, and it was bigger and et cetera. I was so missing the robins one morning, and I opened the front door, and there were like 50 robins out on the lawn. And that was so cool, It made me feel better.
What a beautiful story. Why that title to the memoir? I mean, particularly, of course, why the word warrior?
I didn't come up with that. My Jill Bielowski, my editor,
right,
came up with that title. I wouldn't have come up with that. But I was going to call it For Justice, for Love. And, but it makes sense in the sense that I like thinking of how a poet has words with which to, walk the world and you think about, I guess, if I think about what has always motivated me in this world, and I've been thinking about that a lot, is about what is it as a child? I mean, there were the bees and animals. Interactions with animals have always been important from very, very early on. But as a child, what else? What motivated me? Why did I come into this world? And what came up is, one, the animals healing and justice, is the need for justice, the need for, and the need for justice. And then I think about qualities of a warrior, and it has to do with compassion. It has to do with listening. And because a real warrior, who, and I don't call myself a warrior. I don't go out and say I'm a warrior or anything like that.
I wouldn't think
It's that
so.
Poetry. No, it's that poetry. Any role that we have, any of us, is, we're all called in our human beingness to embody what a warrior embodies. And that's somebody who is awake and is listening and is moving through the world listening. And that's how I see that. That poetry, poetry as a warrior, it's kind of, it's a path,
Well, it makes me think also of other things you've said, such as that a poet is a maker. Poetry can heal, and you have to make something that can be in some way useful. And you say, okay, poem, you have work.
Mm-hmm.
You have work to do. Coming really back to nearly the origins of the word poiesis, as someone who makes, and poetry being put to work. And I, having suffered recently a lot of losses, as so many people have, and so much grief, I was reminded of a poem that offered great comfort, of Naomi Shihab Nye, where she says, people don't pass away, they die, and then they stay.
Yeah, that's beautiful. That's Naomi.
Isn't it?
Yes, I met her. I tell her we were talking about how we met when we were girls. Of course, we were in our 20s, early, we had just started writing poetry. I always remember that. She's beautiful. That's wonderful. It's wonderful.
It's so powerful, and it in a way it offers solace.
Mm-hmm.
Now you've spoken about indigenous and tribal music as one of the roots, perhaps, of blues and jazz, and I'm wondering in what ways do you hear actually those connections?
That's a long one. Yes, well, the connection that most people don't realize that
right.
Congo Square was a Homa village. Southeastern tribal village. And when you realize that Congo Square was that village, then the whole story makes, it's like, there. And that's where the slaves were allowed to hang out on a Sunday. And then what do people do if they have one day? Well, they're going to shop. They're going to have a marketplace. They're going to have music. They're going to meet, share stories, all of that. And so there it was. And then here is, these other tribal people had similar connected ideas about relationships with each other and the world, and living the world, the world and the plants as living beings, and even music having a certain kind of sense about it. And so there you go. And yet we're left out of the origin story of, if you hear our music, you hear all of the elements of jazz and blues are in our traditional music, the Southeastern traditional music.
Left out of the story is something that comes back again and again and again. But rather than going down that road at this moment, I want to ask you a question that actually Natalie Diaz is asking you. She would like to know if you can talk a little bit about Jim Pepper and his work in relation to your music.
Oh man, yeah, Jim is, his mother was of my tribe. His father was Kaw Indian, and so he was one of the first natives to acknowledge, the connection, but also to marry contemporary jazz with traditional native music forms. At the urging of Don Cherry. I think Don Cherry is the one who said, hey, Jim, you've learned all this. Your grandfather has taught you all these songs, and here's jazz, and, da-da-da-da. So Jim put that together. And so when I started playing saxophone, when I was almost 40, I looked Jim up and would hang out with him and learn what I could about music. And I did do a song for him, but I have some music to play, but I have something lined up that, oh man, I have something that lined up that would fit that wouldn't fit that better, but it's a song called I Pray for My Enemies. It's a poem, but then I play sax in it, and we have singers and so on. I have that lined up to play.
Oh, will you?
Yes, let me hope this. I know it will work. I lined it up on here. I think it will. Let's see. Can you hear that?
This morning I pray for my enemies. And whom do I call my enemy? An enemy must be worthy of engagement. I turn in the direction of the sun and keep walking. It's the heart that asks the question, not my furious mind. The heart is the smaller cousin of the sun. It sees and knows everything. It hears the gnashing, even as it hears the blessing. The door to the mind should only open from the heart. An enemy who gets in risks the danger of becoming a friend. This morning I pray for my enemy. And whom do I call my enemy? This morning I pray for my enemy. And whom do I call my enemy? This morning I pray for my enemy. And whom do I call my enemy? This morning I pray for my enemy. And whom do I call my enemy? This morning I pray for my enemy. And whom do I call my enemy? This morning I pray for my enemy. And whom do I call my enemy? This morning I pray for my enemy. And whom do I call my enemy? This morning.
And I had to ask you, I had to ask Natalie for a question from you, and she said, Joy will know what I mean when I say Jim Pepper, and of course, now, and of course now, Joy, I didn't know Jim Pepper, but now for the last 3 days, what have I been listening to? So it's wonderful. This is the great pleasure of these conversations. It's a perpetual education, which brings me to this question. In 1993, you said, "Sometimes I feel that I write as a painter." I'm wondering what you meant back then, and if you still feel that way 30 years later. And since we began with Rilke, as you well know, Rilke was the secretary of Rodin and was so powerfully impressed by Rodin's work, and so powerfully impressed by Cézanne's work, and always felt that I'm just a poet with a pen, and Rodin had marble to carve. And I'm wondering how it is for you when you think that sometimes when you write as a painter.
I started out as a young artist. I was always drawing and painting, and I had some work in shows like when I was in 6th grade. And then I was an art major, went to Indian art school and so on. And there was a moment where I realized I had to, as a young mother going to school, I could not do two arts. I had to concentrate on one. So I left painting, but I always felt, at least my early poems were image-driven, usually very, imagistic, image-driven. I'm not going to say imagistic because I'm not trying to suggest that school of poetry.
Of course.
But that's what I meant is I felt then when I made that statement that I was writing like a poet. I mean, a painter, writing like a poet, right? Writing like a painter. Yeah, I was writing like a poet too. And before the poet laureateship was announced, I was getting ready to start painting again. That was my plan. And my plan was to do a new album of music, and I had most of the songs ready. I have a musical play called We Were There When Jazz Was Invented that I'm starting to work back on now, and I'll be writing songs for that and revising the play that will show that Native people were part of the origin story of blues and jazz. But I also wanted to start painting again. And so once the poet laureateship was announced, I had to move that.
They didn't let you get back to being just a painter, but said, Joy, you need to remain a poet as well.
Yes, that's fine. I can always be a poet who paints too, or my saxophone in the tune that you'll hear. This morning I pray for my enemies. I play soprano sax towards the end of it. And for me, the saxophone voice, I play flute, all of it is still the poet voice.
Joy, do you ever feel conflicted about writing in English? You've described English as a trade language, and I'm wondering if, when writing in English, you sometimes feel you're betraying something.
There's an aspect of that, but sometimes I feel that just writing with words, period, is difficult in whatever language, because as a poet, you're always trying to get beyond the words, whatever language. It's ironic, and the great paradox of writing poetry is that you are using you are crafting words so precisely to get to meaning, but you're trying to get to the meaning beyond words. And music does that. I mean, that's why one reason that I like playing saxophone is that I can get to the meaning beyond words.
Where words are not needed.
Right.
You once said we are losing metaphor in our languages. And I'm curious what you meant by losing metaphor, and what truly are the perhaps very deep implications of that loss.
I'm not the first person to say that. I first learned that from language people. I heard it first when I was living in Hawaii, in Oahu, and racing outrigger canoes. And I would hang out some with the Hawaiian language people who were the culture bearers, who were not bringing back. The culture is very powerful and moves about there and lives there. And but so many of the young people were speaking English, so there was a move to bring back the language, or to grow it, or to what's the word? It's not growing it; it's there, but so that it would flourish. And because in language is, the culture lives there, and that was one thing I heard was that, well, there's people who, what marked our languages. I later heard this with Muskogee Creek language, with Navajo, is that, and now in English, that we speak more towards, I guess we've diminished to texting language,
Right.
Emails or texting language, which often does not harbor metaphor or metaphorical speak. And metaphor, the power of metaphor is that when you look through a metaphor, that door that we were speaking of in the beginning is ajar.
You've spoken about, and we spoke about it a little bit. I mean, we touched upon it, Joy, but we'll come back to it now, about what you call ancestor time. And I'm wondering, what does ancestor time mean, both for you as a Native American and as a poet?
Well, ancestor time is a timelessness.
Right.
And recently I found in my roaming around on the internet, it popped up, is something called an ancestor mathematics. So it says, in order to be born, you have 2 parents, 4 grandparents, 8 great-grandparents, 16 second great-grandparents, 32 third great-grandparents, 64 fourth great-grandparents, 128 fifth great-grandparents, 256 sixth great-grandparents, 512 seventh great-grandparents, And, and then it goes on. But you think about how there's a lot of speak among Native peoples about 7 generations. That's a lot. That's an amazing field from which knowledge springs. And I talk about poetry ancestors, how every poem has ancestors, or every song has ancestors, or, maybe every thought, every dream has ancestors. And it works like that there too.
And we don't often recognize them?
No, or we don't often think that way. I think my experience of this society is that it's so now oriented. I think of America as a teenage boy. Right now, the soul of America is of this country as America, as an entity, a political entity called America, is relatively young in the history of governments and time.
For sure.
So it's adolescent. I see it as in an adolescent phase. So in adolescence, there's not, and of course I'm generalizing, but there is not a lot of attention to past or future necessarily. The emphasis is on now. Now is huge. Now is immense. Of course, now it's all now. You could argue that it's all now, and it's all that way. But there's no perspective. There's a lack. There can be a lack of perspective.
In a blog post, you wrote something that I found fascinating, which I'd love you to expand a little bit on, if you could. You said, a spiritual teacher told a close friend that she would be doing what she's supposed to be doing in life if she just took breath and went with the story of her life. I've thought about that often. We have tests and trials. We tend to fight them, pity ourselves, blame others. And here's the part I found so moving. If we do just breathe, write, drum, blow horn, love it, we'll keep moving, and the gifts can emerge easier than when there is resistance.
Yes.
What did you hear in that, except for your own words?
I guess ultimately that's about just being, being aware of being. And I'm looking over at my plants. They're being. They're not trying to, they're doing their form of breathing.
They don't fuss.
Yeah.
In closing, Joy, I read this. You said it's important to speak the truth in the wound. Otherwise, the lies will just dig themselves in. And you've also said, no matter, I said lightly, more to myself than anyone, we will make it through this past the edge of the wound. And in this wounded time we're living through now, I'm wondering what that other side to you will look like, or you hope it will look like.
But I see everybody sitting at a table. Everybody's there. All the stories are there. All the stories of the wounded, all the pieces that have been lost, everything that we thought we lost, everything, we're all there celebrating. And we have incredible food. Everybody's brought incredible food. Everyone has poetry from their, music, all of it. It's a celebration. Like, we made it through, and we all made it through, not just one person, not just the person who thought he or she could buy herself through, not somebody who had the best education. We're all here, everybody, we all made it through. Wow. Look, we made it. Every one of us.
Joy, it has been a joy to speak to you. Thank you so very, very much for taking this time. I wish you well, and I hope someday we meet in person. But for now, I really thank you for this moment.
Well, thank you so much. And listen to that song and let me know if that works okay.
I certainly will. All the best to you. Stay safe.
Okay. You too.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
To support this show and Dublab's progressive programming, go to dublab.com/support.